see if you can take control of the slides. That's perfect. Okay, good.
Right. Okay, great. Let's get stuck in then. Thank you very much for the introduction. What I'd like to talk about today is coloured by my individual experience at the British Library. I work on the principle that every object that enters a collection has its own unique story to tell, and that particular story doesn't stop when an object gets lost or buried, or even when it enters an institution such as the British Library. What I want to look at today is essentially what happens next. How does an object's personal history affect our own understanding of it and what it tells us about the past? In order to explore this topic, I've chosen to look particularly at the Couling-Chalfant collection of oracle bones at the British Library, not only because it makes a nice thematic link with mine and Selena's talks, but also because I think they do have a particularly interesting backstory. As a bit of a disclaimer, like Selena, this says, obviously, the circumstances are a little bit limiting. This is not new research for me. This is mostly just a collection of my own observations. So I'm afraid there's not likely to be anything particularly groundbreaking, but I do hope that you enjoy it as a sort of case study, and I look forward to the discussions at the end. Just in case some of you are not familiar with oracle bones, I know we have specialists from various fields that attend these talks, so I'll give you a bit of a brief overview about what they are. As the name suggests, they are bones. Generally speaking, they are the shoulder bones or scapulae of ox or cattle, and also the flat undersides of turtle shells known as plastrons. In fact, I was once actually told that these plastrons had to be specifically from female turtles in order to have that nice, smooth, flat surface in order to write upon, as male turtle plastrons were concave in order to help them mount the females. So there you go. These bones were used in divination rituals in which questions were posed to the ancestors of the rulers of the Shang dynasty in approximately 1600 to 1050 BCE. The topics that were posed to the ancestors were diverse as warfare, crops, childbirth, even toothache. They were then heated by placing a metal rod into a pre-prepared pit and groove that you can see in the picture at the bottom here, which are on the back of the bone. The heat caused the bone to crack, and the shape of these cracks were interpreted as the answers to the questions. The inscriptions found in these bones are records of these divinations, including information such as the date of divination according to the 60-day cycle used at the time, the name of the diviner perhaps, and the content of the divination itself. The questions are generally formulaic, but vary slightly between different time periods and factors such as whether or not the ruler took an active role in the proceedings. An example of a common question you might get would be something like, will there be any calamity in the coming 10-day period? And then the answer can be given as a simple affirmative or negative. Although the evidence of this sort of divination practice actually predates and postdates the Shang dynasty, and particularly this period of 1300 to 1050 BC, it's this period that's particularly important because that's where we get the vast majority of these inscribed examples of bones. You take this into account with the physical evidence, such as the order of the cracking and the inscribing, and we can conclude that these texts are indeed the records of divinations, rather than the writing itself being a means of communication with the royal ancestors. So why are they important? They are the oldest extant examples of Chinese writing, or in fact any writing from East Asia. They're also the earliest documentary evidence of the Shang dynasty, which until these bones were discovered had a semi-mythical status, existing only in references in much later historical accounts. And on a slightly more personal note, they are also among the earliest items in the British Library collections, having only recently been outdone by an acquisition that included some ancient Egyptian limestone stela, but we try not to be bitter about that. So looking at an object timeline, we've already seen how these items were created and used in their original time. So this talk, I'm mostly going to talk about what came next, namely their discovery and how they came to form part of the British Library collections. In recent years, I have noticed that there's definitely been an increase in the number of researchers interested in this period of an object's timeline. And as a curator, I've also noticed that because we carry out provenance research, you get to understand how different objects our understandings of individual objects are shaped by the history that goes both before and after their original use. The interesting thing about oracle bones is that we actually have quite a full picture of what happened to them after their creation and burial. In the earlier 20th century, they were discovered and then dispersed. And from then, we know that they entered the collections. This particular collection entered the British Museum in 1911, and then when the British Library was established in 1973, it was transferred there. The interesting thing about the oracle bones is that there's a particularly small window of uncertainty. We know most of its history, but in that small, brief period of time, there was a dramatic knock-on effect of our understanding, and our whole entire understanding of these items has been shaped by this particular period, and I'll explain that a little more as we go through the presentation. The other aspect I want to look at in this presentation is the role of institutions and scholarship itself, and how we all participate in a constant cycle of replication, interpretation, reinterpretation. We build upon the previous research, and we also introduce new evidence that may reinforce or question existing theories. So we flesh this out a little bit, this particular first part of the object after they were uncovered. So the discovery of the oracle bones is generally, or the significance of the oracle bones, I should say, is generally attributed to a man called Wang Yirong. He was a specialist in ancient bronze inscriptions. And I say that he recognized the significance of the bones because the actual bones had already been unearthed some time before and were being sold as ingredients in Chinese medicine, where they were referred to as dragon bones and usually got ground up into a fine powder. Although there are various versions of exactly how this went down, the story generally goes that Wang Yirong was living in Beijing and suffered actually from malaria. He sent his servant out to a popular Chinese apothecary, and what was brought back were these dragon bones. As a specialist in bronze inscriptions, he noticed that some of the characters were similar to those found on the bronzes, and therefore what he was looking at was a very old form of Chinese writing. From this discovery, they were able to work backwards and identify the site of Yinshu, or the ruins of Yin, which was the last Shang capital. Then comes the dispersal. So after the original discovery, it wasn't just Chinese scholars who recognized their value and significance. More than 150,000 oracle bones have been uncovered since 1899, and now found in a number of different institutions across the world. Among the earliest foreign collectors were two missionaries, an Englishman called Samuel Colling, and an American called Couling-Chalfant, from whom our collection gets its name. This particular collection was amassed in Weixian in Shandong province by Colling with Chalfant's help, and then deposited by him into the Royal Scottish Museums, now the National Museum of Scotland, in 1909, and then a portion also deposited in the British Museum in 1911. And as I said, when the British Library was established in 1973, it got transferred there. They actually still even retain the original Couling-Chalfant numbers, which explains why our particular sequence starts at the number 1506. Each of the collections that came from the activities of Colling and Chalfant has its own unique characteristics. The collections now at the National Museum of Scotland are the most numerous. There are about 1,700 examples there or more. There's also a portion of the Couling-Chalfant, of Chalfant's discoveries that were then sold piece by piece to Lionel Charles Hopkins, and that became the collection at Cambridge University Library, which is about 600 objects, and including some of the most interesting and significant inscriptions. The British Library collection has some of the physically biggest examples, and in total it's 484 objects. So as I look into this particular period between 1899 and when they fell into the hands of Couling-Chalfant, there are certain gaps that form in the narrative. The first of these is the fact that original material was definitely lost, or even including before 1899. Some of this you come to expect. It's the usual sort of damage, loss, or wear and tear that comes with historical material. In fact, we are very lucky to have what we do have, especially when you consider that the level of sophistication you see in the inscriptions must mean that other examples of Chinese writing that predate this did exist, but have probably been lost because they were on more perishable materials. Then you add to this the fact that they were used in Chinese medicine, and we simply don't know how many oracle bones may have been lost. The other thing you lose, of course, is context. So it took a while after even after the original significance was recognised for these sites to become formally protected and for excavations to be officially controlled. As a result, the bones spread far and wide. As we've already mentioned, Wang Yirong was supposed to come across his examples in Beijing. Couling-Chalfant formed their collections in Shandong province. All of these are quite far from the original site of Yinshu in Henan province. Ultimately, the collections were dispersed, and the examples we have here actually show two examples of the knock-on effects of this. For example, the oracle bones you see on the left contain a record of a lunar eclipse, of which there is a related matching inscription found in the Hopkins collection in Cambridge. And the objects on the right show how two items, these are both again within the Couling-Chalfant collection, but were assigned two different shelf marks, and only latterly were they discovered to be two parts of the same very nerdy 3,000-year-old jigsaw puzzle. The other thing we lose is reliability. So the more pairs of hands that the bones pass through, the more opportunities are created for things to go astray. There was also a monetary value ascribed to the bones, and it was recognised very early on that foreigners were interested in buying them. This created a huge incentive for forgeries. The very existence of forgeries then cast doubt on every other inscription, and debates continue to rage about the veracity of particular examples. The interesting thing about the bones is that we actually end up with two sort of categories of fake. You get partial fakes, where you get an original Shang dynasty bone, but then you get characters added later, and the reason for this is that the bones were essentially sold by the character. So the value of the bone was increased by the number of characters found on it. So then we also get complete fakes. So we've got some examples here in interesting shapes such as arrowheads, conch shells, bee discs, and this very large, what I can only assume is a leg bone, but it looks basically like a tree trunk and would not really have worked in the cracking process for it to be a real Shang dynasty bone. There are various techniques for recognizing fake inscriptions. They take into factors such as the contents and coherence of the text, the shape and the depth of the inscription, character orthography, and even later some microscopic evidence of the aging along the incisions. However, the problem with all of these methods is they're not always all present. And even when they are, it's sometimes still difficult to tell the difference between inconsistencies based on genuine variation in practice that make it hard to tell the difference between a proper fake, a well-executed fake, and a genuine but inconsistent example of an oracle bone. In this way, oracle bones essentially became victims of their own success. Now we shift gear ever so slightly to a more legitimate form of replication, the type that's done to support scholarship in the growing field of oracle bone studies that expanded exponentially ever since 1899. Over the last 100 years or so, a number of different methods have been used to reproduce inscriptions and compare notes between collections ranging from basic techniques to more modern technologies, starting with, for example, sketches, and transcriptions, and then also rubbings, the earliest of which were created in 1903, but still serve as very useful reference works because of the clarity with which certain inscriptions are picked out. But the problem with transcriptions, and in fact any attempt to transcribe or translate these characters, is that it requires a certain amount of individual judgment. In this particular example here, you can see that many of the characters have been identified, or at least proposed, as being direct antecedents of existing Chinese characters, and therefore they're transcribed as such. However, you can see there's a little character here that has to be drawn because it is a little bit more open to interpretation and may not even have a sort of direct equivalent in modern Chinese script. What you end up with is a mishmash of the text exact as it appears on the bone, and essentially a reinterpretation of the text using characters that can be written with a computer, but also with a few archaic forms thrown in for good measure. In case you're particularly interested, this is a record of a lunar eclipse that I mentioned earlier, which has since been dated, to the best of our abilities anyway, to the night of the 27th of December 1192 BC, which we know would have been visible from Anyang between 2148 and 2330, give or take about 17 minutes. The transcriptions are also an interesting point of deviation between museums and libraries, I've observed. I was actually at a workshop in the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh and was asked if we provide transcriptions of bones in our catalogues. Quite aside from the scholarly problem of being able to provide an authoritative version of the text, I was actually quite surprised by this because this is not the usual practice in libraries, and that's because as a library rather than a museum, basically all of our objects are textual, and so the task of transcribing all of them would be endless. Generally speaking, the safest way to disseminate our collections is through photographs. I've chosen this bone as an example of how the quality and resolution has improved over the years, between the example on the left from a publication in the 80s to the one on the right that was taken just about 5 or 6 years ago. This also particular example showcases the benefits of multidisciplinary research, because at that same workshop in Edinburgh, I discussed this particular bone with a forensic anthropologist who pointed out that they had been incorrectly placed together. The first clue is the shape, because it's much too wide to be the usual shape of an ox scapula. But on this image on the left here, you can see these dimpled areas, and that indicates where the spine would have gone. So unless this animal had two spines, these fragments are actually from two different scapulae, one a left and one a right. As early as the 1980s, we also get microscopic analysis, which was done on the bones, and that proved particularly helpful for studying how they were created and also identifying genuine and fake inscriptions. Finally, we have some more technical approaches carried out on a select number of bones in our collection in recent years, namely 3D imaging techniques of photogrammetry, which essentially is photographing an object in 360 degrees, you can see in the top left, and micro-CT scanning, which we did at the National History Museum, and reproduces the internal and external features of the bone, allowing us to create digital models that are structurally identical to the original bone, some of which we then had printed in 3D, as you can see there on the right. Sorry, it's not a great image, but it gives you an idea. Had I been giving this talk in person, I probably would have been handing around examples of these for you to see for yourselves, but I'm sorry, can't do that under the circumstances. So each of these methods of reproduction do have their own advantages and disadvantages, but each one does add a new layer and a new perspective on these objects, and we hope that over time it will build a more complete and accurate picture of their history. It's certain that a lot has been achieved in the last 100 years, but that there's still a lot more to do. For example, of the around 5,000 unique characters found in the bones, only about a third have actually been deciphered so far. In fact, a few years ago, a museum in China actually put out a call offering researchers a reward of up to 100,000 renminbi for each character they could successfully identify. now we get on to the main part of my job, which is to communicate all of this to a wider audience through catalogue records, exhibition labels, web content, and talks like this. As you've seen, the problem is that most of what we know or think we know about the bones is ultimately subjective. It changes over time, and it's driven by the context in which it was created. The challenge that I face as a curator, as my colleagues do as well, is that we have to preserve and promote the collection, but at the same time capture all of this complexity in an accurate and accessible way. And I assure you that alliteration in those sentences was completely accidental, but I liked it, so I kept it. We, of course, attempt to preserve the original objects, and we do this through conservation, rehousing, and digitization, as you've seen, because digitization not only provides researchers with a tool if they are based in other parts of the world, but even if they are able to get to the British Library, it's still preferable for them to work obviously from a digital surrogate rather than always needing to go back to the original bone. It also helps us promote them in all sorts of different ways. I can't guarantee that we always succeed in being accurate and accessible in all contexts, but we keep trying. And here you can see an example of some of the exhibitions in which we've featured oracle bones in recent years. In the top left, we've got Beyond Paper, 3,000 Years of Chinese Writing, where they were shown as a writing support in 2016. In 2017, at the bottom there, you have them appearing just in the bottom left. You can just about see them. They're a divination tool appearing in the divination section of Harry Potter, A History of Magic. And then more recently, they were featured in the exhibition Writing, Making Your Mark in 2019 as an origin point for the invention of writing. The other aspects of this are mostly digital. We continue to make as much of the information we have about the bones publicly available through digital images, web pages and blogs. And the benefit obviously of them being digital and online is that we can update them as and when new information comes to light. But essentially, as curators, we are not able to necessarily present an authoritative view of all of the information, but we try our best to try and capture all of the complexities and all of the intricacies of these objects. As anyone who studies the past knows all too well, the intervening years from an object's creation into its discovery, until its acquisition into a formal collection, all form a lens through which we view these objects and attempt to understand their original function and significance. Sometimes this lens offers a clear picture, and sometimes the image gets a little bit distorted. But the good news is that modern technologies and new research methods are appearing all the time. They allow us to keep adjusting this lens until more of the picture comes into focus. So thank you for listening, and if you want to get in touch with me after or find out more about the collections, here are some of the ways in which you can do so.